Yeah, sipping on my sip. All right. I guess we are recessed over from yesterday's meeting and we're ready to pick up on the agenda, which is reviewing and updating the use of force policy. And I guess, Mark, if you want to start.
As a just a point of process, are we broadcasting right now?
I believe we are.
Okay. All right. Just checking.
You're
All right.
gonna start by calling the meeting to order and starting with a motion, and then call for discussion.
Okay. Sorry, repeat that.
So call the meeting to order, and then someone's going to need to make a motion, a second, and then open the floor to discussion.
What is the content of the motion?
Hey, Randall.
Whatever action you're looking to take on this item tonight.
Okay, so I call the meeting into order, and do I have a motion?
I move that we resume our discussion of the use of force policy.
I second that.
All in favor, say aye.
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 And Neary, sorry. And Neary is a yes, so I was unanimous. So I believe, take it away, Mark.
Thank you. With the chair's permission, I'm going to just go through some of the observations that I had on the policy with recommendations for at least like looking into it. I do apologize to the commission as well as those who are who are along with us. Inadvertently last night I made a commitment to come back to you today, and I did it over another meeting that was already scheduled. So I'm going to be brief, and I just want to start with, if we could please, this DDO 502. This is, I want to go to definitions, factors in choosing use of force options. I'm kind of jumping around here because this is the order that they're stacked in. Mm-hmm. So if you could just acknowledge when you've gotten that document.
So page 3, right, Mark?
This is
page 3 of 7. I
have 5 separate documents printed out.
Yeah.
Right. Is it page 3 or page 4 of DDO 502? I'm looking at page 2 of 7 right now.
Oh.
So I'm sorry about that. If there were 5, the last thing I sent around was all of it was in a single PDF, and it had all been turned into one 35-page document. And it does have separate sections, but it was one big PDF sent by that had been put together by the mayor's office.
Okay, that's no problem, John. I thank you for that. If you could find the section that relates to, well, how about if we do it this way? Somebody take me to the front of the document. It is
0501. So it goes by, originally this was DD05, and that was response to resistance use of force. Now it is DD0501, DD0502, DD0503, and DD0504. And there are some appendices to DD0502.
Some appendices to 3 to 2. I don't even have the entire document then. So what I have is I have DDO 502, 3, and 4, and I have 2 appendices to DDO 502. So it seems to me that I do not have the DDO 501 and DDO 5. Did you say there was an 05, John?
Nope, it's just DDO 501.
Okay, I will take a look at that later. I'm going to start with 02 if you would join me, please. On page 2 of, I think, 7 pages.
Yep.
The only, there's only about 3 things that stand out in, well, maybe 4 in this document is if you go down to lethal force, it says lethal force is a deadly physical force, force that creates a substantial likelihood of death or serious bodily injury, and it says that this is it says that an officer may use lethal force to protect himself or herself or another person from what the officer reasonably believes to be an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. And it also talks about an officer being able to use lethal force to prevent somebody from escaping when the officer has probable cause to believe that that subject has committed a violent crime involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious bodily harm and or death. So I just find that paragraph problematic in definition, in terms of the whole concept of what I would refer to as maybe applying equal force, or to have some kind of process where, I guess what I'm getting at is it sounds like what I'm reading here is that this is not measured. It sounds like you can use lethal force on someone too, even if that person is only threatening bodily harm.
No, it says serious bodily.
Yeah. So,
but serious bodily harm, serious bodily injury or death is defined just up above, and that is the Vermont statute definition of serious bodily injury or death, and it's not bodily harm, it's serious bodily harm, and that's a very different standard.
So you can kill somebody for that.
For what serious bodily injury is?
No, the threat of it.
I'm sorry, sir?
The threat of it.
So the threat, for example, is a person pointing a firearm at another person. That is a threat of death or serious bodily injury. And yes, a police officer may use lethal force to prevent that threat.
Okay, I guess I'll bring it to your attention just to let you know that it's problematic to me. I'm just going to leave it there and move on to the next thing in the interest of your time, okay?
Mark,
yes.
I have a question. If
Yes.
you go to page 1,
Mhm.
because we're talking about serious bodily injury,
Mhm.
and under 2 and then C, there's the definition of bodily injury.
Yeah.
Does that, I think that if we're going to look at the serious bodily injury, we really need to look at 2C. So
I understand, and what I'm doing right now is mostly just planting seeds, because I don't want to just dominate this conversation and take you guys through this thing, because you're going to have to go over this again. All I'm doing is just flagging it for you right now, and I trust that the commission and the chiefs will have the opportunity to look at this, because I'm going to get off early. I don't want to sound dismissive, but I want to just get through these things that I'm flagging. So that paragraph there, I think largely that's almost about it in this document, except for excited delirium. Excited delirium to me is a theory. There's folks on both sides of the fence that have information on it, but I think it's problematic in this particular document. So I object to it being in this document categorically. I'm going to go over to,
if I may.
Please, let's just move forward, John. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but I just want to go through this so you guys can do your work, because I just want to get out of here.
I'll just say that section was written by Kevin Rogers, who was on the committee to review policing practices. He is an emergency room physician, and trust me, he is on the opposite side of almost everything that has to do with law enforcement objectives. In the sense of being, he's at a
I hear you 100%. I've heard every side of the argument, but still.
And he's talking about it as an emergency room physician and as what the American College of Emergency Room Physicians have decreed to be a real phenomenon.
Okay, so you want to have the conversation. Let's have the conversation then. So here's the conversation: is this language, and folks who are listening online, just Google it right now. This business about excited delirium, right, is often used to justify when police kill folks because they were afraid of him, because he had this superhuman strength, blah, 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 blah. And this can easily go back to the language that's coming out of the case of our good friend, George Floyd, because they're having the same conversations, okay? The language is problematic. I don't think it belongs in this document, and I don't really care who backs it up. That's how I feel. You want to keep having this conversation? So let's go to the
Well,
next.
if I can, I mean,
Yeah.
since we're having this conversation right
Yeah.
now, so if I can suggest, the language about excited delirium in the document
Mhm.
imposes positive obligations on officers about how they should respond rather than negative, rather than permissions, right? So it doesn't say, like you can, because someone is in a state of excited delirium, you can do these things which might otherwise be things that we wouldn't want them to do. What it says is, if you worry that someone is in this state, and I understand completely the concern about
Randall,
whether or not it is recognizable as a
you guys
state.
will debate this later.
But no, hold on. But the claim is, if you worry that someone is in this state, you have an obligation to prevent them from having any more harm.
So you kill him.
No, it does not
Because
say
you're
that.
afraid of him, because you suspected that he has excited delirium and he had superhuman strength. So you kill him.
Can I just ask, Mark, where do you see that it permits additional force? Can someone in a state of excited delirium in the document?
I'm not telling you that I see anything. I'm just asking you to take a look at it and you guys consider what I'm saying and do your own homework and deliberate and decide whether you want to keep it in or not. I'm just one voice of 7 people, and I really just wanted to just flag it and keep moving.
I mean, I just want to make sure I understand exactly what you're flagging about it.
Because it is being used across the nation in many cases in police departments as proper justification to use force, lethal force.
No. I think the way it's being used actually is as.
Wait a minute, you just asked me a question and I just answered the question.
Yeah, and so I'm
Okay.
responding to what you just said. I think that the way that's often been used, is it explains why someone who's in police custody died as a result of this action. And it's a way of saying, the person didn't die because of police force, the person died because of this underlying condition that they were in. And
Okay,
I agree that's a problematic stuff if people are using it that way.
It doesn't belong in this document, in my opinion. I hope you guys have a lively debate. Can we move on? With lethal force, I'm over on what is this? DD 0503. It's good that you have these segmented like these, John. So so on page 2, item E, I was just curious about, if that was really a thing. You guys, you can use firearms to kill dangerous animals. They're dangerous, I guess, right?
Yes. Occasionally officers do dispatch, for example, injured deer. We don't usually, it's a very, very, very rare thing that it would be done on a domesticated animal. But for wild animals, yes.
Okay, I think that was almost the only thing I saw in this document. It was more of a question than anything.
Mark,
Yes.
do you mind if I ask one thing about animals while we're on the topic? And I'm going to embarrass myself because I know this.
Yeah. Let's go to the chair.
I was surprised to not see canines in this, in any mention of that. And we can talk about that later because I don't want to interrupt Mark. So anyway, on the subject of animals.
So I wanted to go to
That's a good question. That's good.
I'm looking at the what is this, 03 or something like that? I think and my notes are not making any more sense. So it looks like should walk through. Officers' weapons in on page 4 of 6, item G. Oh, I see. I was going to ask you if isn't it a procedure that you would take the officers take the officer's weapon in an incident like that? But I see that that's covered down in administrative investigation, so we're good with that. And then over on page 5, in the use of force reports, I was just wondering, could we include something in there about the report to the commission as well? Because we have like an annual report or something like that. And that's that. And then I'll go to DD 0504 is electrical weapons. I don't have a problem with that document at all. DD, that's, what is that? These are appendixes. So I was
Yes.
just wondering, I'm sorry?
I was just going to say, yes, the appendices are about the equipment.
Got
They're
it.
not really about the use of force. They're about the equipment, and they are inserted as appendices because so they can be more easily amended when things change. They have a lot of things like technical specifications for sites, and those things are just not.
Yeah, there's only a little bit that I did come across though that still concerned me, and that was
Sure.
that an item B in appendix 1, it says that those limited lethal impact munitions that can be used to prevent the escape of suspects under appropriate circumstances. I was wondering what that meant, under appropriate. Maybe that's defined elsewhere. So that's the only question I have with that. And then with this last one.
Could I interrupt? I'm sorry. Could you say
Yeah.
that one more time? I just wasn't caught up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm moving too quickly.
That's okay. I just want to make sure we get all your notes.
Yeah, exactly. So in lethal, if you go to DD 0502 appendix 1, I'll slow down a little bit.
No, I got you. I know where you are. Okay.
Okay, in section B,
Yep.
in the second to the last sentence, it says that LLIMs may be used to prevent the escape of suspects under appropriate circumstances. And I didn't know whether John's saying that this is really more technical specifications or whatever, but I just was a little concerned about that because to me, it seemed gray, but I'm assuming it's probably better defined somewhere else.
It's not, and that's a good note.
I just thought it was cute that in the last sentence it said that LLIMs are also effective in crowd control and riot situations. So anyway, the last document is firearm proficiency. And John, I do understand that these are largely just, you don't want to be changing these all the time because they're pretty static. But the biggest concern I have
Commissioner Hughes,
Yeah.
Can I interject here for a second?
Yes,
John, can you read that sentence that you just said again, that LLIMs are also, you called it a cute sentence. Did it say that they're effective in crowd control and riot situations?
Yes.
Okay. I would propose that we strike crowd control. We don't use limbs unless it's shifted from crowd control to a riot.
Told you it was cute.
Civil disturbance or riot would be appropriate, but not crowd control. Thank you.
Thanks,
Commissioner.
Jim.
You're welcome, sir.
So the only couple of things in this, and again, like I said, I understand this is a static document and it's just gibberish, and most people would fall asleep. I did reading this, but one thing on here, duty weapons and handguns, and item D, page 2 for all of you. It says any modifications or accessories that are permanently modified to the weapon must have prior blah, blah, blah. So I'm a retired Army guy, but so I like guns. I have a gun. But the thing is that I don't understand why we would be allowing the police to modify their weapons ever. I thought we have this thing called standard issue. So I'm concerned about that. And then if you keep going over to page 6 or 9, oh, it looks like I'm gonna be able to stick around for a while. Officer-owned rifles. That's another one I don't understand. Okay, I mean, I understand everybody has guns. We love them. But the thing is that I'm just having a problem with an officer. Let me just read this. They completed their probationary period. I'm sorry, you all, go ahead.
Well, what page are you on?
I'm sorry, I'm on 6. Good to see you.
6.
Page 6, item Roman numeral 5, capital letter A. It says officers who completed their probationary period, they may be allowed to carry a personally owned rifle Looky there. So I don't get it. I don't agree with it. I don't think that my police need to be carrying a personally owned rifle, okay? Officer-owned rifles will be presented and approved to the firearms committee, blah, 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 blah. They must meet the following requirements. AR-15s, and so on. I'm very familiar with the NATO 5.56 millimeter 2.223. So no, I don't believe that this is that I want the Burlington Police Department in a position to where you guys got plenty of guns, Jen. They don't need to be carrying their rifles and guns and stuff like that. So I don't think that should be in there.
Can we explain how that came about? That's been around for 15, 20 years. And
It's been around since 1850.
Well, fair enough. But it came about out of a fiscal restraint where we didn't have enough to equip each officer with a patrol rifle. I'm not going to disagree that always having the same firearm and the same ammunition would be an ideal world. But the reality is that there is no money available to do that. The other issue that became very glaringly obvious was the fact that when you are passing rifles back and forth between cars, in and out of cars and in and out of the security lock area, sights can get disturbed so that they're not properly sighted. Some people are left-handed, some are right-handed, etc. So over the years, this policy has been allowable, but the personally owned rifle has to meet some very strict standards. So that's the history of how we got there. It's never been problematic in that we don't deploy the rifles very often. I would tell you that absent a pile of money to buy everybody a standardized weapon and to keep one officer to one rifle so that it stays properly cared for and sighted in, there's not a better solution. So while I understand what you're saying, there are very strict regulations on what type of weapon you can carry as a personally owned rifle.
I appreciate that, Jen, and I also appreciate how to cite a AR-15 and also strip it and put it back together and clean it and all the other stuff that goes with it. And I understand restraints, but on a $17 million budget, I would think that we should be able to find some money to buy some damn guns and not having folks bringing their own in. But I think we can talk about that later, or y'all can talk about that later. I yield to the chair.
All right. So I guess I had some. Are we just going to go through individually on what we think is that the best way to go forward?
Happy to do it either, person by person, or if you want to take it from each of the documents at a time, we can do that also. I've got, my list of comments as well. So.
Okay.
Chair, for me, I don't know if anyone else's, I have them printed out. I would prefer to go through each document and we can all comment. That way we're not jumping around, because I spend more time trying to find the section. So that would be my preference.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, then. I will start then. Let's start then on DD 501, use of force guidelines. All right, I'll start on page 1. So in definitions, which is towards the bottom of the page, right at the sentence, objective reasonableness is based upon the totality of circumstances of any given incident and is defined according to the perspective of an officer with similar training and experience placed in the same circumstances. Is it possible to, I don't know, I feel like there should be, in addition to, I guess, an officer looking at this, maybe like a non-officer looking at that. Is it possible to put language into it stating that, so it's not just somebody trained officer looking at that? More eyes on that.
I think there was a universal observation surrounding terminology, I think it was. What's the young lady's name? I forget her name, and I didn't get a chance to actually look at it. Something about objectively reasonable, but there was some universal change that was questionable, and I don't have it in front of me. I apologize.
So objective reasonable, this is the language from Graham. So this is the Supreme Court standard. the idea of injecting something that you said rather than from the perspective of the officer, if you said from the perspective of a lay person, I mean, part of the issue there is that that's not how our oversight system works. The review is done by other officers and then brought to this body for input. With regard to a court review, of course, the legal review is going to be this standard. From the legal, it is that this is the law. So this is sort of the standard. It's the standard that's currently in H808, which is being proposed in Montpelier. And it's the standard in every single use of force policy that we reviewed during the course of the committee.
So can I ask a question about that? So, so there are kind of two components there. The first is, the steps that an officer would need to take in order for use of force to be justified according to the department's perspective. And the second question is, once a judgment is made that the use of force is permissible, what level of force should that be? And the thought, I thought that the thought was, the use of force policy is expected to, not only is the use of force policy supposed to be stronger than Graham, but also there's supposed to be an understanding that when the department was evaluating the use of force that an officer was employing, it was not going to be bound by a strict legal reading of the relevant terms and categories. And I thought that was part of the understanding that came out of the reform committee meeting, was that we should not think that that the only way that we're interpreting the permissibility of these actions is just according to the legal standard, which is a pretty low standard. But and so while there's the kind of language in DDO 501, which says the department aspires to go beyond Graham in this use of force policy, most of the things that actually carry weight as far as evaluating officer actions are kind of taken from Graham or taken from legal context, where it suggests the appropriate reading of them is the legal reading. So I wonder if there's a way to emphasize in this document first that kind of reasonability is not necessarily going to be in the way that's understood by Graham, or that the department has the right and the ability to evaluate the reasonability of actions separate from Graham.
I think that first of all, this has lots and lots of things that go beyond Graham, of course, that talk about all the things. Graham is a single court decision that just puts that standard in. This is a way of saying all the things that we expect officers to do, whether it's verbally warning, whether it is using de-escalation, all these different things. So I think that it does go beyond Graham. If you're saying in the moments where the rubber hits the road, that Graham is still the floor, that's because Graham is still the floor. I think the idea is to have a document that expects more. And if you're asking for places where I do think this document already gives more places than our current document for a review process to say this, and this were missed in ways that the current one doesn't.
Right, good. I mean, can I push back a little bit? So you say that at the end of the day, Graham is the floor. Graham is the legal floor. Graham need not be the floor for the department in evaluating the permissibility of officers' actions.
And so that's what I'm saying. I don't believe that it is. I think that all the additional things that are in this, from de-escalation to duties to warn, to the notion of saying that, all these different considerations that come into play, those are the things that shape us past Graham and really start to narrow what objectively reasonable equals because of all these things. And in any review of a person, it's not only objectively reasonable according to the court, it's also going to be objectively reasonable according to the training of another officer. So that's where our training comes in, and the policy. So I'm not looking at this the way, I would not look at a use of force the way I don't know. I'm going to make up a town in Vermont, and if it's a real town in Vermont, I'm sorry. But so, if I go to Ogdenville, Vermont, and the police force there doesn't have this kind of thing, then their idea of reasonable is going to be judged by the Ogdenville state's attorney in a very different way than a Burlington officer is going to be judged, because the Burlington's idea of reasonable is going to be defined by this document, by the training that we have for them. And ultimately by, I can only imagine that Sarah George is a very different state's attorney than the prosecutor in Ogdenville. But And again, if there's actually an Ogdenville, Vermont, I apologize.
Yeah, good. I mean, so I just want to push on this a little bit more. And actually, we'll talk about ways in which I actually worry that the other additional constraints have been watered down a little bit, in particular about the kind of the intentionality of an officer's attempts at de-escalation, et cetera. So we'll talk about that later. But
yep.
So you know what Sarah George is going to be considering is whether it's appropriate to bring a legal case against an officer, right? She's not considering whether an officer's actions was in conformity with the guidelines of that. Correct.
Right.
And so this document is establishing how BPD disciplines its officers. What it expects as an organization out of its officers.
That's correct.
And so I just want to make sure that leeway is given in this document to say that this department might hold its officers to standards with respect to use of force that are not, that might not result in criminal charges, might not be elevated to the level of criminal charges, but still can result in sanctions and or termination from this department.
And I think that it does that now. I think that because it does say, it talks about these, frankly, it makes explicit things that a previous police chief characterized as expectations that had never been made explicit and that caused certain problems because of the lack of explicitness. This now talks about de-escalation in ways that the other one only mentioned it once. This talks about slowing things down and about deceleration. This makes all those expectations explicit. And that is the ground upon which a reviewing supervisor stands when determining accountability for an act.
Yeah, so can I ask a hypothetical then? And I know we have an attorney on the call, so they can tell me if this is inappropriate. But so suppose that there's some legal precedent which establishes that this officer's behavior in this circumstance was judged by the court to be in conformity with the reasonable officer standard. So there's some legal precedent for that, and this department, BPD, wants to discipline an officer for performing what is basically the exact same actions. This department wants to say, no, we judge that that's not a reasonable action in this context. In your reading of this, of DDO 501, does this department have the leeway to say, yes, this action was adjudicated by the courts as meeting the reasonable officer standard, but it does not meet our standard, and therefore we're going to impose additional discipline for that reason?
I do believe that. I can't remember if you said in your reading does it, or if you said do you believe that it. I do.
Right. Right. Okay.
So I want to know, I want to know what the other commissioners think about this language. Just out of curiosity, I think it's problematic. You can call it the ceiling or you can call it the floor, depending on the way you're looking at it. I mean, I'm a civilian, and our hope is that we don't have to engage into what we already know to be a problematic system, whereby the vast majority of the times when a law enforcement officer when there's an attempt to make them to be held accountable for their actions, then 99% of the time they walk away because of this Supreme Court decision, and because there are generally no independent prosecutors looking over their shoulder. So we're talking about a system that's already problematic. So my thing here is I think the language is problematic, and I just want to hear what the rest of the commissioners have to say about it, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Mark, I'll pipe in. We're talking about the definition under number 3, but also under number 3, when I read through it, I have questions even in more detail about ABC. It really kind of, the document outlines, I think, and this is where I think it goes into more depth. That's how I'm reading it. I kind of thought, okay, so we're aspiring to go beyond Graham. Well, what does that mean? And then as I continue to read, then it outlined what that means. So that provided clarity for me. I don't know how other people feel.
Thank you.
I can pipe in. If we then go and look at ABC, you know, and not being a cop and being a civilian, I had questions like, if we look at A, de-escalation, force can often be avoided through the use of de-escalation techniques. And we talk a lot about that. And I understand and de-escalation is different than de-acceleration. I'm wondering what those de-escalation techniques are. You know, what are they other than slowing things down, maybe using, but you know, where do the officers get training in those? And actually, I'm going to say more than training, being someone that's done training is only as good as if you have practice. And that practice has to come on a consistent basis. You know, practice is anything, whether you're doing a sport or you're doing a martial art or you're doing whatever. But so the training and checking a box for training, it's the daily, weekly practice of those that I'm interested in. But I guess those are layered questions, Chief Murad.
So policies don't usually sort of explain what the training is, because the training is going to evolve and change. I do think that we do a lot of training on de-escalation. It's a component of our annual patrol procedures training. It is a component of any of the training that officers do if they are getting training to be members of to be qualified for the emergency response vehicle. And insofar as practice, again, our officers certainly do it more than any other police department in the state, as far as having the volume of calls to which they go. And de-escalation is practiced at all of them. It's just sometimes it's not successful, or a situation really can't be de-escalated. I think there are scenes where, you know, we've seen some where de-escalation didn't work as well as it should have, or didn't go as well, but we don't hear about the huge number in which it went exactly the way it was supposed to. Insofar as spelling out what de-escalation training would be, no, I did not do that. It's mostly because in my experience, policies don't explain training. They'd get very, very long if they did. We can insert more language about training in here and about the necessity for it, and to be clear about it. But this goes a little bit in hand with, for example, some of the requests last night from viewers about wanting explanations of what excessive force is, or things that are excessive force. The danger there is that if you limit, even when you say, for example, includes but is not limited to, once you start delimiting what, here's an example of excessive force, here's an example, then you kind of leave out all the others. You either try to come up with some incredibly inclusive list, or you don't. You just say excessive force is any force that's not reasonable. And rather than spelling out, for example, kicking somebody who has one knee on the ground and one hand on the ground but isn't fully on the ground, or whatever sort of permutation you want to go. I would say the de-escalation similar, because what is it? Sometimes it's one thing if a person is elevated in this way or in this situation. Sometimes it's something different. But again, including language about training so that we emphasize the importance of training and recurring training, absolutely. If we can find places to put that in, that'd be great. Describing
historically we don't specify training into policy, and now that the policy has to come before the entire commission in order to be updated, we absolutely should not be putting it in unless it's an appendix, because policy and best practice and what's the best, most current training changes far more rapidly than I anticipate this policy changing. So marrying it to policy means that every time there's a new or different piece to use of force training or de-escalation training, makes it problematic in terms of keeping your policy current. That's why specificity about training is rarely in a policy document.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Michelle, before you go on to the other ones, can I actually ask, because I'm sorry, were you talking?
Yeah. Can I just pick up back on something that on the air, the last sentence where it said the officer should not intentionally escalate a situation unnecessary. I find that language to be, weak. So that's how I just feel. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask about that also. So the previous language, of course, was stronger. the previous, there was a draft that I saw where it said, officers must take care not to escalate situations unnecessarily. That language was changed to officers must not, I'm pulling up here if I can, officers should not intentionally escalate situations unnecessarily. Of course, again, that harkens to the legal language, and that's a very high mens rea category requirement. I'm like, it's going to be impossible in almost every circumstance to prove that an officer is intentionally escalating a situation. And in fact, that's often not what we care about. We don't care whether an officer is intentionally escalating a situation. What we care about is whether an officer's behavior could be reasonably understood as escalating a situation. Right? If an officer does not understand that that cursing at somebody might escalate a situation, they don't understand that, they don't intend to do it, but it does, and every reasonable person would understand that it would. That is something which is problematic. And so I think that we should weaken that language of intentionally escalate to something which is, again, either appealing to a reasonable person standard or just say that officers should not escalate and put the onus on them.
Right. I was thinking we take out the word intentionally.
Shannon, this is being recorded and you're going to be able to capture all this, right? Okay.
I understand that language was requested to be added by BPOA. So I don't know whether they have, I assume that they have someone who's in the meeting right now, but so I don't know what that process would be for working that out going forward. But I do have strong concerns about the use of intentionally escalate there.
I appreciate what you're saying. I feel that I maybe am embracing what you're saying about a reasonable person could logically expect to escalate or something, because I want to be very clear that some people we deal with, they escalate themselves and there is no de-escalating. It's a little tough to make it the officer's responsibility when some people are completely irrational and unreasonable and unable to be de-escalated.
But does the word... Sorry, go ahead.
No. I just want to say that we have to be careful that in our quest to make officers more accountable, which this policy improves vastly over the existing one, that we're not creating unattainable situations when you apply a written policy to where the rubber meets the road, to Church and Main at 2 a.m., to wherever it is. We have to keep reality in mind here.
Right.
So I
agree.
This wording can be noodled, but I'm not sure exactly.
Well, to me, the saving grace was the word unnecessarily at the end, right?
Yep.
So there are scenarios where it will be necessary. So that's where I saw that it gives them the room when, for example, someone else is escalating.
Well, I hesitate to think about a situation where it is necessary for an officer to escalate a situation. That being said, I completely understand Chief Morrison, the point that it should not be incumbent upon me to understand whether or not, for example, you all is going to be, offended by anything that I say. I might say something about, cats and figure out he actually, really gets aggravated by the mention of cats. That's not my responsibility to know that, but that's because that is an unreasonable, so that, no reasonable person would understand that would have that escalatory effect. So I agree that there's something worrisome about just leaving the standard as officers, should not escalate a situation if they don't know that some behavior might in fact do that. But I think that if you set the standard as intentionally escalate, that is not only going to be impossible to actually discipline an officer on the basis of, because that's going to require some understanding of their mental state prior to performing the action. That's going to be very difficult to do. It's not no one writes down in their notebook, I'm going to escalate this situation today, right? But also, again, intentionality is not the relevant criterion here. The relevant criterion is whether it's a reasonable action to perform under the circumstance, and that's something which, again, I'm happy with the reasonable person standard. I'm not happy with an intentional standard.
Are you comfortable with the language that was there, Randall? The should take care not to?
I am, yes.
I want to be on the record as an excused departure from the meeting at this point. I do appreciate hearing me at the top of the meeting, and I wish you all well tonight. Thank you for your service.
Commissioner Hughes, I'd just like to say Thanks. It's been great working with you.
You're leaving. That's right.
I'm out.
It's going to be Friday, right?
Yes, sir.
You're coming back though, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So it seems so fatalistic for a minute. I thought I was waiting for the door to get kicked in at any minute now.
No, that's not.
I'll see you later, Jenny, and my blessings to you and your husband. Okay. We'll continue to pray for you.
Take care, Mark. Thank you.
Can we go back to page 1 on this document?
Yes, we can.
So I'm wondering on the very last line, if there's a reason why subject safety is not included. We have officer safety and safety of the public. Not sure why public subject safety isn't included in that.
I believed them to be a component of the public,
I would agree.
but I'm happy
except
to state it.
the only reason I say that, Chief Murad, is because up above under philosophy, we distinguish public officers and subjects.
Gotcha.
So
Yep.
throughout, I think we use the 3 terms. So it just begged the question to me, is there,
That was not a sneaky attempt to
No, I didn't
say
think
that
it
we don't-
was. I didn't think
But no, I appreciate that.
I want that. So, I mean, I feel as though the discussion from before, I don't feel like I got a proper resolution of it. So I'm wondering, DC Murad, whether in that first paragraph of the definitions section on page 1, whether some language can be included. After, when you state objective reasonableness is based on circumstances, blah, blah, blah. I'm wondering whether some language can be included there that explicitly says that the department's evaluation of reasonableness need not conform to either the legal standard or the standard set in Graham.
Randall, should we change the last sentence to better capture that? Because I find that last sentence doesn't really say anything. It says aspires to go beyond Graham, but maybe that's the sentence where we are a little more direct about this.
Well, so I mean, I take Michelle's point earlier that the remainder of this document tries to give a broad overview of the ways in which specifically in which it tries to go beyond Graham. But I think that the main question is just how are we interpreting objective reasonableness? And my worry is still that because Graham is mentioned so prominently in this definition section, it seems to me as though a reasonable observer might read this and think, okay, objective reasonableness is going to be defined throughout as whatever the legal standard is as it's established in Graham and other case law. And I worry that that's not the message that we want to convey. And so I just wonder whether that can be made clearer.
I think my daughter just got attacked by one of our puppies. If you heard crying in the background. Is everything okay out there?
Hey, John, go deal with it. I can answer this question. Go ahead. Go find out. So Commissioner Harp, I believe that we would have to have an internal discussion with legal counsel about that. I also would need to read the collective bargaining agreement because I don't want to make a commitment in this venue that would put us in trouble or contradistinction to other documents and commitments that already exist. I completely appreciate what you're saying, and that if we worded it in the effect of that for the purposes of remedial training and internal disciplinary processes, we are not bound by the standard in Graham, et cetera. That might be workable, but I don't want to commit to that until we talk to legal and check with the union contract, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I think all I wanted was a codification of what I understood DC Murad to be saying in his response earlier, which was, right, his understanding was that this document does not commit the department to interpreting the reasonability standard as it's interpreted in Graham. So I just wanted a codification of that, since it seemed like that was his understanding of how it would be read.
Sure. I want to clarify that. The reasonability standard is still Graham. the idea of what makes that up is now added to by a whole bunch of stuff that's in this and given as expectations and given as understandings of these are the things that we want done, that we believe should be done. And while that's not as firm, for example, as saying, there's certain things that say must and will, there's certain things that say should, but you add 6 or 7 shoulds up and you have a strong case. You also have a case that, again, unlike other historic examples, is one where it's not a matter of saying that I want this because of my purview as an executive or a leader. It's because we talked about these things, we said these things, and they're now here and listed. And if there's a failure to work within those, again, they are expectations, but they're articulated expectations.
I think he just wants a little bow to tie up the fact that expectations articulated in policy that raise the floor beyond Graham v. Connor could be grounds for counseling, remedial training, discipline. Am I understanding that correctly, Commissioner Hart?
I believe so. And I'll just state kind of in perhaps a more clear way. So I just want to ensure that a future police commission, right, that, so any future commissioner who is considering a case of potential officer misconduct and sees, video evidence of behavior that commissioner, that future commissioner, does not think comports with the standards of the community, that if it is that commissioner's opinion that behavior does not comport with the standards of the community, and that commissioner wants to say, this seems like behavior that ought to be disciplined and ought not be considered to be in keeping with the standards of reasonability that this department ought to promulgate, that the response would not immediately be, well, it's according to the definition of reasonable conduct, this meets that in every way, and so our hands are tied in the department. My hands are tied as chief, for example, because it meets the standard of reasonability as it's set out in this document. So I just want to make sure that a future chief and a future police commission have the leeway to establish community expectations for reasonability, which might go beyond the way that's interpreted in other places.
Does this make any sense? And again, I'm not the attorney and I'm not the technocrat, so this is not my greatest skill. But when I'm reading this, the piece that I kind of was nudgy about was the BPD aspires to go beyond. Would it have more teeth? And what I'm hearing people say, if it said the BPD use of force guidelines go beyond Graham to ensure. So we're not aspiring to, we actually are going beyond.
That's what I was looking for before, Michelle. That's what I was trying to get at, that sentence it just aspires doesn't really say anything. No, because then what I'm understanding Chief Murad to say is this document goes beyond Graham. So why don't we just say these guidelines go beyond Graham, and then the rest of it is talking about how it goes beyond Graham.
Yeah,
I would just note that doesn't address my concern. I think that's fine. That doesn't address my concern directly.
So, Randall, do you have language proposed?
I suggested some language. Chief Morrison said that she would have to run that language by legal counsel and by BPOA.
I think, yeah, and I think that's where we would have to leave it and circle back. I appreciate the sentiment. I don't think it's incompatible with what the rest of the document says. So we just are going to have to run it by legal counsel and get back to you.
That's acceptable.
All right, moving on to page 2 of DDO 5.01. Looks like we did touch on de-escalation. It brought up points of you all brought up the last steps of de-escalation. Do we want to further talk about that? I'm seeing no. As I look through this, I'm curious.
I
So
still think that the language should be changed.
did it change? Okay. So yeah, I look at that and
You all, are you talking about the last sentence in A?
Yes.
And Chief Murad, had you offered that potentially it would revert to what the language was before? Is that where we landed on that? Hope you're muted.
If that is the commission's, yeah.
So you all, do you have in mind that language, what it was before? Do you want to hear it?
Sure. I don't have in mind. If someone has in hand, that'd be great.
DC Murad, do you have that language?
I believe it was officers should take.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Randall?
All right, so go ahead.
Officers should take care not to escalate situations unnecessarily.
Yes, it must instead of should. Yes, officers must take care not to escalate situations unnecessarily.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, that language sounds much better. The one that Randall just said.
Actually, can I just say, I mean, so, sorry, I know we're moving on, but there was also a sentence which was omitted from the later draft, which was included in the earlier draft. That sentence, it was at the top of page 2 of the June 3rd draft, and it was omitted from the June, I believe it was 5th draft. That sentence is, furthermore, the use of force must either be in response to resistance or to protect themselves and or other officers and or other people. So that imposed a constraint on when force would be appropriate. That sentence was omitted from the later draft. And I was just wondering why that sentence was omitted.
Because there are levels of force that are permissible to be used to protect property.
Thanks. I'm pulling up the draft again. Sorry.
Preventing somebody from shattering a store window or breaking a car's window, those are legitimate acts of use of force to prevent a crime from being committed. And again, as long as the level of force is objectively reasonable for the accomplishment of the goal. But it was because that did not allow for protection of property.
So it seems like then there are two options. One would be adding in property in that description. The other would be omitting the sentence entirely.
Omitting the sentence was also done simply because the definition of force is all over. It's in other places, and it was stated in other places, and so that was my rationale for it. It was a matter of sort of streamlining it, but I'm happy to put those things back in.
I'll check and see whether I feel as though those constraints are captured elsewhere. I don't remember reading it carefully for that. So I'll look at that while we discuss the rest of this.
All right. I guess jumping to force, it'd be, I believe the second, I guess technically the third paragraph, where it says there are times where force is unavoidable. If you jump down to officers should recognize that their conduct prior to using force may influence the degree and immediacy of force required, and officers should always seek to minimize. I would like to scratch should and insert will always seek to minimize the necessity of responding with force.
I actually also had this sentence underlined because I'm wondering if it should just be clearer what we're saying here. Officers should or must conduct themselves in a way to minimize. The word seek to me just didn't say what I think what we're really saying is conducting oneself in a way. It's just a thought.
What would that phrasing be?
So for the second part after the comma, and officers must conduct themselves in a way to minimize the necessity. So I think, Jabu, you were wanting to change should to must, right? Did I get that right?
So will.
Officers will always seek to minimize.
Will always. Okay. So will conduct themselves in a way to, if others don't feel strongly, but seek just seemed weak to me.
I definitely agree with. I agree with Jabul as well. There should need to be a change.
So I'm getting a little concerned that we're really painting people into a tight corner, because remember, the primary situation is that when officers encounter a situation or a situation already in progress, we come in with force superiority. We're not going to meet force with force.
Right.
Come in to control the situation. So making a document that says you must come in at the minimal amount is not the way this actually works on the force continuum. So I want to be careful that we're not contradicting the underlying fundamental principles of a force continuum by saying that.
Well, presumably, I mean, the force continuum would require that it come in at the lowest level of force necessary for the situation. And
Necessary
so,
to overcome the force being offered or the resistance being offered. That's correct, but not the minimum. So words matter, and we need to be very careful.
No, I'm saying no. The minimum which is appropriate for the situation.
Right,
So
right. So you don't jump 18 levels above. Understood. So if there's a way to wordsmith it so that it's consistent with the rest of the policy, I don't want us to get into contradicting ourselves in different sections of the policy. And
Right,
that
well-
sounded like we were getting really close.
So what I'm hearing is officers must use the minimum amount force necessary to control the situation. Right?
So I'll say this: it's funny in the clause before. So it's a long sentence. It's arguably almost a compound sentence, but I mean a run-on sentence. But in the clause that begins the sentence, that probably arguably should be a must, not a should, because officers must always recognize that. That doesn't mean that they should always do that or that they can't always do it, but they must always recognize that their conduct can contribute. With regard to the next stage, I think there is something to say that, officers will always seek. I think there are times where they will always seek to minimize the necessity. I think that is still saying to the officer that your goal should never be to go in at a level that is egregious for the situation, but you still have there's still the recognition that it's not. It's very often not the officer's choice.
The next sentence actually addresses the necessity.
That's true. It does.
I almost feel like officers must recognize that their conduct prior to using force may influence the degree and immediacy of force required, period. And then the next one's, I don't know what other folks see, but
That's great. I mean, that gets us, however, then you delete the and you capitalize the O in the next officers, but we're still where we are. Are we still saying, are we saying that officers will always seek? Are we saying that officers
No, I think Michelle was saying take the rest out, right?
take the rest out entirely? Understood.
Yeah, I'm for scratching that. Yeah, officers should always minimize the necessity of responding with force. I say scratch that whole sentence.
Okay.
Any other thoughts and comments on that?
I apologize. I thought I was following. Which sentence are we striking?
I'm sorry. So
Second clause of the fourth sentence in the paragraph beginning, there are times.
Okay, thank you. No objection.
All right, moving on to page 3. I don't have any notes. I don't have any personal notes on page 3, so.
I don't either.
All right, moving on to page 4. I did have one. Correction on here. So under point C, under point 1, it says tools should be removed only when their use is anticipated and shall be secured safely when not in use. I wanted to change should to will. Tools will be removed only when their use is anticipated and shall be secured when not in use. Any thoughts or disagreements on that?
It's a quick question for the chiefs. Do you see any significant disciplinary options that are taken off the table if the language is should rather than shall or will?
Disciplinary options taken off the table? No.
See any additions that are put on the table?
I do. Yes, I think that it does put addition. I mean, I think so. And that is probably something that may have to be reviewed, but I think will is stronger than should.
Right. I was just saying. So, but so you said should adds options to the table, or
no. I said will adds.
Right. That's what. Right. That was my understanding. Right. I mean, presumably you would still need to, there's still need to be an explanation of the circumstances under which a should was violated to make that violation of that should justifiable, correct?
Yes, I mean, if it says you should only proceed through you should only proceed through an intersection when it is safe to do so, then the difference between that and you will only proceed through an intersection when it is safe to do so is not huge, but the will is certainly stronger than the should.
I mean, I just right. Just
so,
to be clear,
so what I'm saying is this change is
right.
change what the chair just suggested is a change that is more affirmative. It is more affirmative.
Right. No, understood. So I mean, my question was just if an officer violates a should or violates a will, in either case, the officer would need to give some justification for the violation of that policy, whether that's a should or a will, correct?
I think in any instance, an officer is going to be able to give a justification for certain things. And I'll say the same, for example, with excessive force and things that we talk about in here as will not be tolerated and are really, really clear and unequivocal on. There are just this past November, during an apprehension of a man who had just left a whole string of damage down Church Street and was shattering car windshields. When confronted by officers, he initially was compliant and then he became immediately uncompliant and began to bite an officer hard enough that it penetrated through his pants and through his skin. Nobody else could see that happening. The officer began to strike that man in order to get that person to let go. And a sergeant on scene told the officer to stop, because from the sergeant's perspective, that was an unnecessary use of force. It was not an unnecessary use of force. That officer had to go to the hospital for the bite and had to later, worry about things that the subject stated about his health condition with regard to that bite that gave the officer a lot of sleepless nights. But that's an example of saying, I thought you were doing something. And I mean, that was reviewed in the instance. It's not like that went anywhere. But an officer does yes, officers have means to say, this is why I did this thing that appeared to be, but was not. They have to be able to articulate. And I think that goes with what the chair is saying here, which is if you chose to pull your weapon, you should have a reason why you did so. And a should is not, you will have a reason why you did so. I don't see that as being a insurmountable change.
Right. I mean, I don't want to linger on that, but behavior which seems to violate a prescription but does not is different from behavior which does violate a prescription, but again, let's say a should. A behavior which does violate a should, but it's judged that there's reason for the violation of that should. So I mean,
you just said that, but that's the thing, Randall. You're saying that there's justification for it. I guess what you're really trying to determine is if there is no justification for it, is the should less disciplinable than the will?
If there's no justification?
I'm sorry, without justification. In other words, you just did it.
Right.
I pulled my firearm while on Church Street because a person, for no reason.
Right.
And you should not do it versus you will not do it. Yes, will is a stronger term. And so insofar as
even if there's no justification, you think that will is a stronger term than should?
I think that if there's no justification, there's no justification. But I think that the should probably does create some sense of difference there. Yes. But that's why I'm suggesting that will is the right thing here for what the chair is.
No, that's right. But I'm sorry. I do want to linger on this a little bit because this will affect how I go through the document, the rest of the document. Right. So it was my understanding in reading this that if some language in the policy says officers should not do X, right?
Should not is also different than should.
Then which one would you like to start with? We can start with should if you'd like, or we can start with should not.
But what I am saying is that, okay, the justification will not is the level of justification that's going to be required to overcome a will not is going to be higher, is going to require a stronger affirmation by the officer than something that is a should not.
Right. No, that right. So that I agree with. No, the question was if it seems that there's no justification whatsoever for the behavior. Right. So the language. So let's take two different rules. Right. One says officers should not do X. One says officers will not do Y.
If there's no justification, there's no justification for it. It's still not. It is not permissible, and it's disciplinary. But according to this.
But you think that the disciplinary options are the same if there's no justification? Should not. It says should not do X. I do X. I have no justification for it. Then presumably the level of discipline available would be the same as if it said will not. Is that correct?
I would say that what we're talking about here is then every will would just have to be accompanied by some sort of parenthetical unless there's justification. And that's the nature of the should to me.
Right. Will without having justification.
Because will is stronger, then every single time you use will, you have to insert a parenthetical that says, unless there is justification.
No, that's right.
You will not do this unless there's justification. You will not do this unless there's justification. And should narrows that by not needing that parenthetical.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
But it's still a prohibition.
That's what I want to get at. I just want to make sure I'm understanding how you're using should and will, because again, as I was reading this document, when I saw should, I saw, if you violate this and you do not have some explicit justification, that is disciplinable to the same degree as if it said will not.
Yes.
Okay, so because if you're not saying that, then I want to go over all of the shoulds and wills much more carefully.
I'm not saying that. I am not saying that.
Okay, that's fine.
All right.
Can I just say one thing? Just while you guys
Yes.
were debating this, I looked up the difference between should and will. I don't know if this is going to have any impact, but I was curious for myself. There is an important difference. Should implies necessity. And they give an example, the building materials need to be stored. Never mind. Will implies that in the future something is going to happen, just according to, so.
That's a descriptive, not normative use of will. I think that's not the one that's appropriate in this instance.
Okay.
Any other corrections or any review on this final page here? DD05?
I had a question. Sorry, let me find it here. I just wanted a reason why it's in C of the same page. It's in the last sentence. It says they can change out their holsters if approved by an officer in charge. Why would that be necessary? Did I read that wrong, or?
I'm sorry. On DDO 5.01.
Yes, on page 4, it's just above the point we were discussing just a minute ago. In the last sentence, tools, trainings, and tactics.
Oh yes.
It says with use of force should carry them in approved holders when performing uniform patrol functions, unless otherwise authorized by the officer in charge. I was just wondering why they would need a different holder.
So frequently there are ergonomic reasons. We have some holsters that reside on a gun belt on your waist or your hips. Some people have doctor's notes that say that they can have a different holster that is secured around their thigh, their upper thigh. And in other cases, if you're doing a modified assignment on patrol, you might carry a holster that is similar to what a detective carries for that shift only. But your regular duty gear, when you're in full uniform, is different. So that's there's a lot of reasons why you would have a different holster.
Great. Yeah, that explains it. I was just wondering. It just seems I didn't read it as that. Sorry.
So I don't think that just for the purposes of my notes, I sorry to go back to this. I'm not sure. Is it going to be should or will? Will. Okay, thank you.
All right.
But again, to answer Randall's question, there's not. No, was the answer to your question, Randall?
Yeah, I got you. Thank you.
All right, that concludes DDO 5.01 use of force guidelines. We shall move on to. So sorry. I just misplaced it. Firearms. My apologies. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Moving next to DDO 5.02 definitions, factors in choosing a use of force option, use of force options, excited delirium, and duty of care. Page 1. Are there any comments, suggestions, or modifications? Right, moving on to page 2. Anybody have notes, modifications, or comments on any of these?
So I think that Mark brought up, we're on page 2 of 7, correct?
Correct.
I think I had a note that Mark brought up a point about lethal force.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. His note was that he finds the definition of that there's no definition of not measured to be problematic, or what does not measured mean?
Oh, this is where we got into serious bodily injury, but it right. Okay. I don't have any comments on this section.
Okay, so sorry.
Neither
The
did I.
note was towards the end in the last sentence where it said, has probable cause to believe that the subject has committed a violent crime involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious bodily harm and or death, and has reasonable belief that the suspect's escape. He finds he finds that to be problematic. The bodily harm portion.
Does anyone have any concerns there? I think we can move on.
I do not. Moving on to page 3.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Excuse me. I'm so sorry. In E of the serious bodily injury, it talks about the strangulation and blocking the nose or mouth of another person. And in DDO 5, I think, or later in DDO 501 or DDO 502, I'd have to look again. I wrote it down. It talks about prolonged asphyxiation, and I was wondering if that could be included in E somehow.
So E is straight from the Vermont statute. And that's why, I mean, the definition of serious bodily injury as a definition is simply a definition that comes from Vermont statute. To sort of hone it, are you saying that you'd want an officer to see somebody choking someone for at least 15 seconds before they felt that that was serious bodily injury, or?
No, it's just the language here. I'm looking it up. The language later at the end of this on page 7. I guess we can talk about it then. But it's talking about prolonged, and I was wondering if that could be included. They just seems like you're saying, like in. Let me go back to it. Real quick.
I think you're talking about positional asphyxia, which is a different thing than strangulation. So strangulation is about putting, and this was an addition to the Vermont statutes based largely on expanding the definition of serious bodily injury to incorporate domestic violence, which unfortunately but frequently involves choking. And it is now a component of serious bodily injury as a legal definition, and that's why it's there in the definitions part. You're referring, I believe, to the section of positional asphyxia, which talks about prolonged prone positioning. And it's not asphyxia of this kind, it's positional, meaning the position of the person that leads to that. And is something that is why, for example, as soon as possible, a person who has been put prone is put into first what we call a recovery position, and then immediately brought up to knees or to standing. By far, one of the obvious things to any officer in the country watching what happened in Minneapolis was the absolute lack of care for the positional asphyxia component. And yeah, that's what that means. So those are two different things.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't read into that well enough. My bad. I understand.
No, it's all esoteric stuff, and it does get adding on, and it's a lot.
All right, I guess to jump back to page 2, we were all set with page 2. Then move on to page 3. All right. Any notes, comments on page 3 that people had? I had one note here, and jumps back to my point before. So for number 3, factors in choosing a use of force option, and under A, assessment factors, whenever feasible and consistent with officer safety, officers should attempt to use de-escalation and deceleration techniques to minimize the amount of force necessary to or avoid use of force. I thought we should change should to will again.
I don't have an objection to that, owing to what my assurance to Commissioner Harp that I believe them to be interchangeable insofar as an ability to assess and review from a later standpoint. But I also don't want to complicate things by changing some or changing all. There's an element to that.
Well, in this circumstance, it's already qualified by the first
Yes.
part of the sentence, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree.
So will works for you then, Commissioner Harp? Is that what you're saying?
It does.
Any other comments or points on this page? Moving on to page 4 then.
Actually, Jabu,
Yes.
this is to the chief, for like the number 1, the 8 subject or officer. It is a reason that the S is in parentheses.
That is a grammatical convention for implying that you can be talking about a single officer or multiple officers, or a single subject or multiple subjects. So it's simply a way of saying that we're not. Sometimes there's more than one subject. Sometimes there's more than one officer, and so those are considerations. It's a grammatical convention. That's all.
All right.
For having your cake and eating it too. It is a way to have your singular and your plural at the same time.
Thanks.
Moving on to page 4. Any questions or comments?
Did Mark have a comment here? No, okay,
I did not have any in my
Okay.
notes.
all right, just making sure. I don't have anything until we talk about excited delirium.
All right then. I had 2 quick things on here, which tie into things from before. So for B, additional factors. If you jump down towards the last sentence, says when BPD officers have knowledge of these disabilities or conditions, they should factor this knowledge into their response to the individual, so long as it's safe to do so. I thought that we should change should to must, saying that they must factor this knowledge into their response to these individuals, so long as it's safe to do so. Any concerns about that?
I mean, honestly, I'm not. I don't think I object. I'm not sure what it adds exactly.
Fair.
And, I mean, just the worry is, because presumably the thought would be there's a circumstance where an officer ought to be disciplined for not factoring that knowledge of those disabilities into their response. And so the thought might be, if the language is merely should, then discipline would not be appropriate, but the language were must, and the discipline would be appropriate. And it's difficult for me to imagine that situation, where they would not be disciplined under should, but they would be disciplined under must. I mean, if DC Murat, if you can think of a situation like that that you think might be illustrative, I'd be happy to hear it.
I can't. I mean, this goes to the whole notion of these things being either interchangeable or not interchangeable, and that there are, for example, the so long as it is safe to do so is in fact a clarification. I don't have a preference in this instance. I think.
Right. And like I said, I don't object. I just worry that, like I said, it feels to me as though any disciplinary body or any police commission would have the tools necessary to, be concerned about officer behavior if it says should, rather than, even if it does not say must. But like I said, but if you can think of a situation like that, I would be happy to hear it. I'm not trying to kind of weaken the requirement there. I'm just worried that, when you the idea would be, when you then ask an officer, like, what exactly were you thinking about when you made this decision? if they say, okay, well, I didn't factor in the fact that they had this known disability, then you say, oh, well, it said you should have, and they say, oh yeah, but it didn't say I must, so it's okay. I don't worry either way, I suppose.
Sorry, Chief.
I guess, guys, I really want to ask a fundamental question here, which is the purpose of this policy to give the best practice guidance to our officers and to ensure best possible outcomes? Or is it just to give a measuring stick for discipline? Because that's what I'm hearing right now. And I'm not liking that direction. Policy is never inviolate. Only rules are inviolate. Policy always has room for exceptional circumstances. It's defined that way in DD-01. So there is no policy that's ever going to be concrete and covers every possible situation under the sun. But I guess what I'm saying is that as a matter of good policy writing, we have to kind of keep the goal in mind, which is to have a best practice to give our people clear guidance. And yes, if they fall short, allows us to correctly point out, this is where you fell short. Here are the ramifications and consequences. But the policy document itself is not meant to be the gotcha. And that's a little bit of where I feel we're going. And I don't think that's not how I see the role of policy in governing a police department. We already have a rule that is inviolate that talks about you must use reasonable force. So there's already a rule that applies to all.
I agree with that. The only thing that I would say is, and I think I agree with that in this particular circumstance. The only thing I would say is I think having a clearly articulated policy it will not be sufficient for determining, for officer accountability if the worry is that officers do not, meet a standard that we want to have them meet. But the policy might be a necessary condition, and so having that clear necessary condition established would be a helpful thing. Although, like I said, I agree in this circumstance.
Okay. Any other questions or comments on page 4? Okay. Moving on to page 5. Any questions or comments on this page? I guess this is more of a question. It says, sorry, for number C, for aerosol agents, number 1, officers should avoid using OC to overcome passive resistance. I honestly don't understand why you would ever need to use OC in a passive resistance situation. So could that not just be changed to officers will not use OC in passive resistance? I guess my thought behind that is that second it changes something more than that, you'd I guess be allowed to use it. So why is it phrased like that?
Honestly, part of the rationale is that OC is although it's ranked here above, for example, control and impact techniques, it in fact is less damaging than control and impact techniques. And so if you remove OC as a possibility, then you are going back to, for example, how do I move a person who's passively resistant? Using physical force. Or you're removing a tool that is actually a tool of relatively low, that is almost as low as you get, and in some ways is counterintuitively lower than the thing that it's above, at least in this continuum. Using a strike, which you can't use on somebody who's not active, you have to have active resistance. OC spray, at least in Vermont, is generally is permissible for passive resistance that is actively not cooperative. So mere passive resistance of, and part of this may be a need to define passive resistance, but I mean, there too, if we could definitely revisit this and talk about this as with.
John, I have a question. Is it considered passive resistance if, let's say, a group of students, I guess because I used to work in student affairs at UVM for so many years, but they're protesting, but people have chose to lay down in the street, and there's an emergency vehicle that has to get through. Is that a case that it could
That's
be?
a form of passive resistance with students. I mean, I don't want to suggest that this is the appropriate response for that.
But it's an
again,
option.
It says that you should avoid it, but that is
Right.
a form of, insofar as just, is that passive resistance? Yes.
If an officer is in somebody's home and has told them they are under arrest, and the person refuses to get up from their kitchen chair, there's options. Some of them are hands-on. Some of them are leveraging with a baton. OC spray is certainly one that has far less risk of actual injury to the person and can be quickly decontaminated. So I think I understand that the policy as written does not allow us to indiscriminately spray passively resistant people. But when you take it off the table completely as an option, you actually are forcing officers to jump to a higher level of force than they may have had to in very narrow circumstances. So I believe that leaving it in there as a option, not one of first resort, of course, for passive resistance, but there will be times where that is a better option than going hands-on.
I can see that point. Anybody else? All right, moving on to page 6.
So this is
Any,
where we had a discussion before about excited delirium. And I just
Correct.
want to say that I agree with Randall. I actually like that this is in here because it's providing protection for subjects that I think is important, and gives assistance to officers in terms of how, to look for this as a condition.
And I just want to, I apologize, Commissioner Hart, just on the previous page in the OC section, to keep it consistent with Chief Morrison's observation about the use of LLIMS in the appendix, I'm going to change crowd control to riot control to make it clear that that is what we are talking about, that that's a serious disorder event. But I just wanted to let everybody know that that would be noted as well. And if you can make that note, Shannon, and it's on page 5 in C, riot, not crowd. I apologize, Commissioner Hart. Back to
No, it's okay. I was done talking. I was done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just say in response, I mean, I would be certainly kind of cautious about any appeal to excited delirium in a legal context for, to explain the death of someone in custody. But I don't see any support for what I would take to be an inappropriate use of excited delirium in this policy document. So I'm with you.
I mean, it's coming from an emergency room physician, if I understand correctly. I'd be interested, do we know if there are similar policies out there? Was this something he drafted from scratch, or is there?
He reviewed what was in the existing PPD use of force response to resistance directive, but he also included the language, he struck parts of it. He added additional requirements for care, and made it much more prescriptive insofar as sort of the duty of officers to try to prepare for that or address it if they see it. But where that came from, I did not ask Dr. Rogers that, so.
All right, moving on to page 7 then. Any comments, notes, or questions? I'm not seeing any. Moving on then to DDO 5.02 Appendix 01 LLIMs.
So just to reiterate, I have that appropriate circumstances may need to be clarified in B. And I have civil disturbance and riot situations in B as well, and a scratch out of crowd control. So that came from our previous discussion.
Okay, and this is not relevant to this section, so I apologize, but in response to Commissioner Hart's question earlier, you are going to include something about the use of canines for officer force?
So, okay, so yes, thank you for bringing that up, Commissioner Hart. So yeah, I mean, canine, are you asking, I wasn't certain, you brought it up in the context of using lethal force against animals. I assume but did you mean officer canines? Did you mean?
Yes, that just prompted
canines?
me that when I was reading through this, I recognized that there wasn't any reference to canines for controlling subjects, apprehending subjects.
So obviously, you know, the Vermont Canine Association and the canine officers are trained at the state level, and they do have very strict regulations about when it's used, how it's used. That isn't in this. It wasn't in the previous one at all, and it escaped me, to be frank. So I'm happy to put together a section of it that would be sort of another. I mean, we'd figure out where to insert it. It would probably be. It would need to be inserted in a couple places, both as a mention and or possibly as an appendix, another appendix of but no, I think it would be best inserted in I'll have to consult with our canine officers and a lieutenant who for a long time was a canine officer and determine whether or not that is something that goes into the use of force options or whether it goes into the definitions. And then I will present that to everyone.
So forgive me, are there separate directives on canines or?
No.
Okay, so it wouldn't be duplicative to have something in these documents.
Well, I'd have to look again. I'd have to look to see to make sure and cull through our directives, but
yeah, if it's dealt with elsewhere, but at least a reference to that within lethal force or wherever.
All right, so we made note of appropriate and changing crowd control to civil. Sorry, what was the term? Civil
disturbance. Is that
civil disturbances in riot situations?
Jabu, I just have one question for John. What part Dr. Roger wrote? All right.
I can't. I mean, I can send the body the email that he sent me, and you can see what was, how what he sent me got restructured, just reordered, but not changed. I'm happy to do that. With regard to canine, we have a canine directive. That canine directive talks about use of force and basically just refers us back to this directive, to the existing DDO 5, and again talks about officers may use force, and canines are a form of force that is only in context that it is reasonably necessary to achieve.
And it's usually equated with an impact weapon, like a baton. That's generally the level of force that a canine is authorized to be deployed at. Would be to chase someone down and grab a hold of them, or in the same level as an impact weapon. That's how it's always been interpreted during my career.
Joel, if I understand your question, I think the answer was just, it was the excited delirium section.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's what I was asking for.
Yes, Randall.
Yeah, it was just it was the excited delirium section from DDO 502.
Mm-hmm.
That is, I mean, that if the question is which part did he contribute to, it is just that section. If you're asking which words in that section were directly his, I can show you what he sent.
Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't mind. Yeah, please do so.
Awesome. Moving on to page 2 of DDO 502, Appendix 01. I am not seeing anything. I'll move on to DDO 502, Appendix 02, Firearms. Any questions, comments, notes on the first page? Not seeing any. Any for the second page? Not seeing, hearing any. Page 3.
Sorry. Wasn't
Sorry,
wasn't one of Mark's comments on page 2? Or maybe I'm confused. I may have wrote that down wrong.
No, I think you're correct. Under D.
Mark mentioned modifications to duty weapons. And the answer to that is that modifications include things like a different grip, or I want to have, some officers do put a light on their firearms. Those are modifications. It doesn't change the functionality of the weapon in any way.
And is that like the scope of the modifications you're allowed to make, like just grip, just adding on a light, as opposed
For
to
a handgun? Yeah, I mean, you can't change its caliber. You can't change the rate at which it fires. You can't change those are the primary things that would change its functionality. And those
Right, you can't change its magazine capacity or anything about its lethality, but you can customize it if you want to have a light or a different type of front sights that are easier to see in dark as you get older. It's easier to see certain front sights than when I was a rookie. And grips. For smaller framed hands, you need to have a different grip than for much bigger hands.
Okay. I'm okay with that. Any other comments on page 2? Not seeing any. Moving on to page 3. Moving on to page 4.
I was going to ask a quick question. Are there any significant changes in this section between what was in the previous use of force policy?
To which are we talking about? To the weapons section?
Just, correct. In these appendices, Appendix 1, Appendix 2.
No.
Right.
Jabu, I have nothing else on this policy. Mark had one thing, but I don't have anything for the remainder of it.
Yeah, Mark had one thing, I believe, was on page 6 under officer-owned rifles.
Yeah.
I thought Chief explained the rationale behind that. Anybody else have any more further questions? All right. Does anybody have any notes on the rest of this section? All right, moving on to DDO 5.03, lethal force. Any questions or comments on page 1?
No.
Moving on to page 2. Moving on to page 3.
I'm sorry, can I just pause really quickly?
Absolutely.
And this is not on this section, but just because I remember seeing it's required that officers verbally warn prior to using lethal force. My understanding was that, my recollection was that there's also a duty to warn prior to other uses of force when permissible. I just want to confirm if that's the case.
Yes, if you if you go back to page 5 in DD, so if you go to DDO 502 on page 5 at the very top, it includes all of those with regard to any force, not just lethal force. And in that way, it is farther, that is a place where it goes farther than the 8 can't wait standard.
Thank you.
Moving on to page 3 of DDO 5.03 lethal force. Moving on to page 4. Moving on to page 5. And I believe in my notes here, I have Mark asking for under section 7, use of force reports, to add the police commission in the use of force reports.
So, and I understand, where would that go?
I'm sorry, I'm looking at, I don't recall him exactly specifying where it would have gone into, but
Didn't.
yeah. I'm sorry.
He didn't specify. I mean,
okay.
I don't want to speak for Mark. I mean, I think, but my understanding is that Commissioner Hughes just wants to make sure that the police commission has access to the information that we need to do our jobs. I don't know whether it needs to be here or specified somewhere else, but I think that is his concern. So again,
this could easily be rolled into the summary that we give on citizens' complaints and such. This could be a second component, or it could be a standardized report every quarter, twice a year, whatever periodicity the commission wants. It's easy enough to do. The question really is just how, and because a lot of things. Go ahead, John.
Sorry, Chief. I apologize, Chief.
No, go ahead. I'm done.
I also do. I think that actually, if you just look right up the page at G from section 6, that you could include the police commission in executive session in that sentence.
Okay.
And that wouldn't be their use of force report, but it would be the same thing, really.
Okay. I have no objection to that. Anybody else? Any objections to that?
Well, I'll just say, I mean, that applies only for lethal force. That does not apply to general uses of force, which I think was
correct.
Commissioner Hughes' concerns.
That's correct. And actually, frankly, that's a rationale for moving the entirety of 7 into DDO 502.
Well, we as a commission did get use of force reports. I think what we could do, I don't know if it's here or in the other document, just say quarterly that the use of force, and actually we got those use of force reports. We were not in executive session, I don't think, if anybody, Randall or Shireen, if you remember.
I'm actually not remembering. I don't remember us getting use of force reports because we got complaints, but this is a whole.
I actually have one. We had use of force reports, and we talked about how many, what that looked like, and a use of force also meant, whether you pulled your gun out, whether you. Yeah, I mean,
we've received, summaries of use of force reports. For example, at the end of the year, we might receive a summary of all the use of force incidents over the year. So we did receive that, but we don't receive individual use of force reports as they are filed by the officer at the time.
That's true. Yeah. Okay. I was thinking of the summary. Is summary enough, or are you thinking that we want to have access as they happen? What are your thoughts?
Okay, I won't speak for Commissioner Hughes on that point. I don't know what he would think would be.
I do have here noted that he made the suggestion going along with twice a year that the use of force, like a use of force report, is provided to the commission twice a year, is what the note says, that he said.
So that
Okay,
would,
thank you. So
Mhm.
go ahead.
I would say that would be similar to what we received once a year. We would have it twice a year. I
So
think,
I'm happy to codify that the police commission should receive, summaries of use of force incidents over a certain period of time at a regular, duration. I don't know whether this is the appropriate place for that, but I agree with the overall concern that should be something which is regularized for the commission.
Chief Morrison, do you do anything with these use of force reports? Are you already maintaining a database where so we're not putting more administrative work? I'm not saying it's not important to have this data, but I'm wondering if you're already creating a summary or a report that gathers this instead of us reading individual reports,
Right. No, it would not be a burden to aggregate use of force reports twice a year for you. And obviously, if there were a use of force issue that you had concerns about,
we could ask.
we would bring it as part of probably an executive session, because if it were
Yep.
of concern to you, it would probably be part of
Right.
a internal investigation. But the use of force reports themselves, I believe portions of those are already public facing through the Vermont Criminal Justice Training Council, I believe. But again, I will defer to my use of force experts. We have a rather lengthy internal review process before they would go anywhere out of house.
Yep.
And then we have no problem providing that data to you twice a year.
Great.
I suggest we put it in the document that says role of the police commission.
Agreed. I think that's the right home for it. And that helps you have a better insight into the operations of the PD.
Agreed.
I agree as well. All right. Any more questions or comments on page 5? Moving
One
on.
question. Sorry.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, a question on page 6. So
Moving on to page 6, questions or comments.
I have a comment, C part 2, firearm discharges used to dispatch injured animals. It would be my understanding that any discharge of a firearm would be, that there would be a report filed, even if it's, especially since I understand that that dispatching of injured animals does not happen with great frequency. So I wonder why there's an exception made for that.
Because it certainly, if a report is made in Valcourt, there's an incident, the officer doing so reports over the air that he's or she is going to use that level of force. A supervisor approves or not necessarily, again, possibly over the air. So, I'm at the far end of North Avenue. There is a deer struck by a car. I'm going to use lethal force against this animal. That's reported, but there's no use of force report for it. It doesn't factor in with what it is that we're trying to track.
Understood, but but it seems a simple enough thing to me, just in principle, to say, any discharge of a firearm gets, that there's paperwork for that and that gets filed. So I go ahead.
Yeah, that's yes, we could make that change. It is a matter of in larger,
No, you can't, because then you conflate your use of force data. It gets counted as a use of force.
It's reported.
And there's no human involved. And now you've artificially inflated or deflated your numbers. So if every time you dispatch an animal, and we happen to dispatch, say, 10 in a year or 12, you now say you have X plus 12 use of force incidents involving a firearm over the year. And then you have to go back and disaggregate the data to say, oh, but wait, 10 of them were to dispatch an animal. So no, it does not belong in use of force data keeping. But that's not to say that there shouldn't be a written report of why you discharged your firearm to put down an animal.
There is. And again,
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Commissioner, you go.
No, I just wanted to verify. But there is some written report which is made about the discharge of that firearm.
100%.
Okay, thank you.
I believe that concludes page 6, DDO 5.03.
And just to clarify again, I am going to move the entirety of this section 7 into DDO 2 as section 7.
No
Simply
objection.
because by putting it with lethal force, you're implying that the use of force reports are only done for lethal force, and that is not the case at all.
Right.
Okay. All right, that concludes DDO 5.03 lethal force. Moving on to DDO 5.04 conducted electrical weapons, CEWs.
And with this section, so in our current directives, we have DDO 5 and we have DDO 5.1. Now, DDO 5 talks about CEWs, but DDO 501 talks about them only and is done in keeping with the state's model policy. This is the exact same. I didn't change anything in this one aside from turning Burlington Police Department to BPD and inserting sequential commas because I prefer them. But other than that, there are no changes because frankly, this one is largely dictated by the state. So happy to go through it with everybody and look at it. And again, you know, if there's an argument for making something firmer, then that's an argument we can discuss. But this is the state policy.
Okay. Did anybody have any questions or notes on this one? I'm not seeing it.
Sorry, sorry again. I'm sorry. I wanted to read back through it again, but maybe you could just answer the question for me. Is there like after the use of the CEW, is there like a medical response that is going to happen afterwards? Because I'm sorry, it's probably in there, and
Nope.
I didn't see it because I know personally that when somebody gets tasered, that they have a more likelihood of cardiac arrest and some other things, and I was wondering if that is addressed in the policy.
So it is. It is on page 4 in post-deployment procedure, and it is. There are requirements for how you remove the probes, requirements for what you do if there is additional medical issues, like what you're describing, if somebody shows some sort of cardiac distress or other kinds. So that is all accounted for in that. And that's actually a good portion of page, the bottom of page 4 and page 5.
Great. I missed it. I forgot about it. Sorry. Thank you.
Anybody else with questions or comments on DDO 5.04?
None.
Seeing any. All right, I believe that is all of the documents to review. Pardon me, Joy. How do I proceed next? Sorry.
So your next move is that you want to adopt the policy. You'll need another motion, a second, an opportunity for any additional discussion, and then a vote.
Okay.
Well, but there are still some things that are being looked at, some revisions that need to be made. Right? We can't vote on. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that. With that being the point, do we need to then table this until we get these revisions and then vote on it again? I'm sorry, I'm just unclear of the protocol moving forward.
Plus, Mark is not here to weigh in as well, technically.
And we have a quorum, but because there are some changes and some of the changes are significant changes, the committee will have to.
So do you want to wait and have another meeting where you can look at a finalized draft incorporating these changes that have been made tonight?
The other option is, if people have confidence or faith that the changes will be executed to their satisfaction, we can empower, DC Murad to make the changes that we discussed. But I think that there are some things that, at least in my case, there are some things that I would like to hear further information back from. There's some things that we're going to go through both the city attorney's office and BPOA. So I'm uncomfortable voting on any policy right now. I would like to see that come back, and that's going to take more time, which is unfortunate. But I think given the comments that we've made today, that's necessary.
So we have our next meeting. We have a meeting in 2 weeks?
I believe it's 30th.
It's the
It's
20,
been
no,
scheduled for the
the meeting is the
23rd.
Can
23rd.
Sorry,
Joy, can
23rd.
23rd.
23rd. My apologies.
can this meeting be extended again in order to make those changes and come back to it in this same and have it be this same meeting?
I believe so. I believe you could recess this meeting and come back to it in the same spot.
I guess
I
my
would-
only
I would
concern.
be-
sorry.
Go ahead.
I guess my only concern with that is picking a date that would include Mark, knowing they'd be here, but since he's not here, sorry,
Why
I
don't we,
just
can we pick a tenant, can we pick a date and,
Well, if you recess, you have to do a date certain. So we'd have to know exactly when we're
That was
recessing
my-
until.
Does someone want to try calling Mark? Maybe he'll pick up his phone. I don't know.
Yeah,
We could try calling.
text.
you know?
Sure.
Are you
send
gonna,
a text.
are you gonna do it?
I
Karen?
can't. I've got Neri. Sorry, Neri's still on the phone with me.
Chair, are you texting him? now?
I'm texting him right now. Sorry, so give me a moment.
Neri, are you following along?
Yeah, I can hear most of it.
Okay. I'll let you know what they say if you can't hear, okay?
Are we setting up a new date or is it gonna be the next meeting?
I think we're going to set a recessed date for these policies.
Mark is actually calling me right now.
Okay.
Perfect.
Hello.
Hey, did you call me?
Yeah, you on the speakerphone with everyone.
Nobody can hear me right now.
Everyone can hear you right now.
What?
Everyone can hear you right now.
Oh, okay. Everyone on your thing?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
We can all
I
hear.
mean, everyone, including the whole the commission and the chief, and yeah.
You are live on the air, Commissioner Hughes.
Passing it from here.
Commissioner Hughes, we're just trying to.
Hold on for a minute. Hold on for a minute.
Chief Murad, while we're waiting for Mark,
Yes,
make these changes, could you please make them in red?
I
so
will.
that-
I will do them in track changes so that we
Okay.
can see what was there and what was not. And I'll
That would-
distribute it as a PDF of track changes.
Thank-
And I believe there was only one section, Commissioner Harp, where it was mentioned that, there might be a need for review.
That's correct.
And I'm sure Shannon has that written down and we can figure that out. But that, we'll tackle that one appropriately and then.
Hey, how about now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you.
He's Mark is back. Randall, you
Can
want to
you
go
hear me?
ahead? Yeah.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
We can, Commissioner Hughes. We're just trying to figure out, there's some changes that we want to make and we want to set a date to do another recess. But in order to do a recess, we have to pick a date certain. So I was wondering if you were able to check your calendar and see if we can schedule a recess date to get some changes and vote on them.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you all was telling me you guys could hear us broadcasting.
No.
Okay,
This is
okay,
different.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm really sorry, guys. I was in the middle of a meeting and I was getting excited. So let me just take a quick look. I'm sorry for that. Let's see. What date would you like to do it?
I personally am completely open. So
Does the
So,
7th?
I think there's a sense of urgency here. So can we get after it on Monday?
So DC Murad, how much time do you think you would need to make the
How about
changes?
Tuesday? Or would you need longer?
Would you be able to give us something by Tuesday?
I absolutely would. I could do it by Friday or Thursday. I mean, I could do it by tomorrow.
Okay.
I have nothing tomorrow night, Friday night, but I know that somebody else on this did.
Yeah, we're jammed up all week, John.
And then Monday, right? So and then Monday there is a city council meeting on Monday night that I'm hopeful that I don't have to be there, but we shall see.
Tuesday.
Neri can do Tuesday. Neri and I are Tuesday.
Tuesday works.
Tuesday
works for me.
Yeah, it's great. I'm just gonna tell my Bible study folks just that I'm still. Hopefully, I can still get into heaven.
Okay.
I move that we recess.
Thank you so much for reaching out to me on this. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
What time on Monday, on Tuesday?
I move that we recess until Tuesday, June the 16th at 6 p.m.
I second that. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye. Aye. And Neri is a yes or no?
Neri said yes.
You say yes? All right. I believe that's technically unanimous with, yeah, it's unanimous, correct?
Yep.
Awesome. So yeah, move to recess the meeting then.
Okay, thanks all.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.